day long, the blazing midsummer sun beat down upon that square mile of abominations, upon tens of thousands of cattle crowded into pens whose wooden floors stank and steamed contagion, upon bare, blistering, cinder-strewn railroad tracks and huge blocks of dingy meat factories whose labyrinthian passages defied a breath of fresh air to penetrate them, upon rivers of hot blood, carloads of moist flesh, rendering vats and soap cauldrons, glue factories and fertilizer tanks that smelt like the craters of hell. Chicago's Union Stockyards used to stretch over a square mile of the city's south side, lying between Halsted, Ashland, Pershing, and 47th Street. The stockyards opened in 1865 on a swath of former swamp on the outskirts of the city. Built by a consortium of 9 railroads, the pens soon attracted enterprising industrialists to build meatpacking plants adjacent to the yards themselves. Philip Danforth Armour was the first to open a modern, large-scale packing plant adjacent to the yards in 1867. Gustavus Swift, Edward Morris, and George Hammond quickly followed. By 1900, the yards employed 25,000 people, had 130 miles of railroad track within their bounds, and had slaughtered over 400 million animals. The growth of the stockyards was driven, most importantly, by technology. The construction of railroads during the 1850s and 60s propelled Chicago to be the hub of the nation's entire rail network, connecting the livestock-rich plains of the West to the hungry cities of the East. Technology not only provided the economic climate for the stockyards' great success, but also drove the continuing growth of the meatpacking industry. At the Armour & Company plant, a great motorized wheel lifted live hogs off their feet and onto a moving overhead trolley. As the hogs moved through the plant, employees along the line repeated their assigned task: slitting the throat, cutting the meat, removing the entrails, over and over, as each animal passed by. This disassembly line is said to be the direct inspiration for Ford's motorized assembly line that would go on to revolutionize the auto industry. In 1878, Swift & Company engineered the first successful refrigerated boxcar, which opened the Packers business up into the entire world. Ice was held in compartments at the top of the boxcar, so the chilled air would flow downward over the cargo. The meat was packed closely at the bottom of the car. 2 years later, the Swift refrigerator line had over 200 cars, and as Armour and the other packers quickly followed, meat processed in Chicago began to be sold as far away as continental Europe. Along the northern edge of the stockyards stood factories that used the remaining bits and pieces of slaughtered animals to make a variety of byproducts. Hair, hooves, intestines, and fat were turned into brushes, glue, casings, and margarine. The stockyards were famed for using everything about the hog except the squeal, but this wasn't exactly true. Behind their factories ran the South Fork of the Chicago River and the Stockyard Slip, which the packers used as a great open sewer. They dumped livestock carcasses, blood, and entrails into the water until it constantly bubbled with toxic gas from the decomposing filth. The surface of the creek was so caked with fat and hair that it would often be walked upon, until the packers began to gather that too and turn it into lard. This stretch of water was one of the most infamous features of the yards, and came to be known by the name Bubbly Creek. The 1900 reversal of the Chicago River, a technologically fantastic feat of engineering in its own right, was intended partially to keep the stockyards' waste from flowing out of Bubbly Creek and into Lake Michigan, where it tainted the city's drinking water. The Union Stockyards had grown to be one of the most important parts of Chicago's economy and its culture. This importance was great enough to earn a dedicated connection to the city's rapidly expanding L network. The Stockyards branch left the South Side Elevated, today's Green Line at the Indiana station, following the tracks of the Chicago Junction Railway before snaking into the stockyards. Sailing over the cattle pens, it opened into a loop around the packing houses, with 4 stations named after the plants they served. The L not only carried workers to their jobs, but also brought tourists who came from Europe and beyond to marvel at the stockyards sight. The stockyards were considered to be such an important part of Chicago that they were featured on postcards and souvenirs alongside attractions like the Wrigley Building, the Lakefront, and the Board of Trade. By the mid-1950s, the stockyards' fortunes had begun to change. The first slaughterhouse closed in 1955. The stockyards' L branch ceased operating in 1957 and was demolished shortly after. One by one, the packers shuttered their plants, and the stock pens grew gradually emptier. On July 30th, 1971, the Union stockyards were finally closed for good. The pens were demolished, and in their place, the Stockyards Industrial District, a modern, suburban-style industrial park, was built. Intended to attract fresh employers and save the surrounding neighborhoods from plunging into poverty, the fledgling industrial park created a home for a new generation of technology-focused companies. As the stockyards lost their industry, many large buildings remained vacant and have been left to ruin. However, given the area, many companies have been wary to purchase these otherwise viable buildings. When Pure Foods decided to leave Chicago in 2007, Bubbly Dynamics purchased their building at a massive bargain. They paid approximately a quarter of the cost of the material value of the steel alone. There, Bubbly Dynamics founded a non-profit called The Plant. They have been working to clear out the space and rent out to food-based startups, retrofitting the space as they go, reusing as much material from the building as they can. While it is a slower process, they stand for sustainability and eco-responsibility. They plan to create a self-sustaining environment with net zero energy by using an anaerobic digester, which will sustain an aquaponic farm, a brewery, a kombucha tea company, and commercial kitchens, while also having enough energy to heat and cool the building. Basically, this system works by taking the natural waste from the people in the building and the food sectors and putting it into the anaerobic digester. This creates both a gaseous byproduct, which goes through a turbine generator to turn into electricity or steam, and a physical byproduct to feed the fish for the aquaponic farm. The aquaponic farm uses the relationship between fish and plant to grow, at this time, leafy greens, as they're the most hardy given the indoor setup. Specifically, aquaponics is the combination of the positives of aquaculture, where you grow fish in a farm setting, and hydroponics, where you grow plants without soil. To do this, one requires very little energy input, and it creates very little waste output, so it's very sustainable. Due to the nature of this process, all plants produced are entirely organic. Along with the aquaponic farm with its greens and tilapia, there's a mushroom farm and a more traditional outdoor farm that sell their produce at farmers markets or give it to people in food deserts so they can have access to fresh greens. When they started, the plant had a worm farm, which didn't pan out. However, there are plans to soon raise chickens and bees on site. The plant has had massive support from the community and beyond. They hosted a Kickstarter in late 2013 to gain support for the continuous construction and retrofitting of the building. They raised over $60,000 to support the growth of the aquaponic systems. They have plans to create a new entry and teaching spaces to give back to the community, a small history museum to keep the roots of the building around, and also a community kitchen with the money raised by 2018. Thousands of volunteer hours have gone into ensuring that the plant is able to create this space from something previously synonymous with waste and pollution. If you walk through the Stockyards area today, it looks just like another quiet, modern, industrial park. Trucks rumble into loading docks and freight trains slip past on new, straight steel rails. The plant buzzes with visitors who come to tour its aquaponic farm. At Testa Produce's newly built LEED Platinum certified distribution center on Racine Avenue, the 200-foot-tall windmill spins in the gusts from the lake. The businesses are successful and sustainable, and at first glance, the area seems quietly unremarkable. But a careful look behind the walls of modern factories and around the corners of long-forgotten side streets reveal a few dirty vestiges of the area's gruesome past. Bubbly Creek, or what's left of it, still bubbles gas from the carcasses caked to its bottom. The southern end of the creek was so hopelessly polluted that it was filled in and paved over long before the yards closed. The remaining part of the waterway is the city's most dangerous body of water, incapable of supporting life. As recently as 2004, core samples from the riverbed revealed a fibrous layer of still decomposing stockyard gunk 3 feet thick. The Swift & Company employment office, shown here underneath the demolished Stockyards L branch, remains abandoned on Packers Avenue. Behind it sulks a former Swift packing house, a relic that somehow escaped the wrecking ball to live another life as a produce warehouse. On Halsted Street, the empty Stockyard National Bank towers over the sidewalk, and in the center of Exchange Avenue stands the Union Stockyards Gate, a national historic landmark that one day might be the only physical piece of Chicago's meatpacking history. In the end, it was technology that drove the withering death of the former world's greatest stockyards. Transporting live animals from western states all the way into Chicago was costly and difficult. By the 1950s, interstates and trucks made it possible to slaughter animals where they were raised. Improvements to the refrigerated boxcar, the stockyard's very own invention that had made it possible to ship their meat to the East Coast, now made it possible to ship meat processed in Colorado or Texas to the entire country. Technology had made Chicago the meatpacking capital of the world, but after a century had passed, the stockyards couldn't resist technologies rendering them redundant and obsolete. As some parts of the city wane, others find themselves in midst of a revival or change. In the West Loop and River North, digital technology has inspired hundreds of new startups, companies focused on exploring a business model or idea to see whether it could scale up to be profitable. 1871, a remarkable moment when the most brilliant engineers, architects, and inventors came together to build a new city. Their innovations, born of passion and practical ingenuity, shaped not just Chicago, but the modern world. Founded in 2012, it's located on the 12th floor of the historic Merchandise Mart in Chicago's River North neighborhood. It has been a central hub for technology growth all over the country. With its location in Chicago, 1871 has rapidly enabled the growth of new technology companies.
Well, so Chicago actually does have a pretty long history of startups. Even the big companies today, the electric companies or whichever industry you're looking at, were very small companies at one time, startups. I think part of what part of the process occurs because in our country Chicago actually was a logistics hub because of the lake and the rivers and ultimately the roads and then the airports. So Chicago as a center of movement of goods became a place where a whole lot of things happened. A lot of different industries collided and a lot of innovation occurred. And with that comes lots and lots of startups. Startups in industry, startups in finance, startups in hospitality, entertainment, all of which we have quite a few. In recent years, a lot of the digital startups, since the beginning of the internet, and particularly the browser back in the 90s. A lot of that activity happened here as well. And what happened was people began to now just use these technologies more. We began to use the internet a whole lot more for many things that that make it more convenient for us or make it easier for us. So it solved a lot of problems for us. So as people got more and more used to these technologies and the use of them, they began to adopt a lot more, and therefore became a bigger market. And Chicago, there's a lot of people that are smart, know how to look for problems to solve, and then have the ability to solve those problems, whether by through their skills in computer coding, or their skills in manufacturing things, or their skills in financing, funding, and management particularly. So, and then what happened in 2008, of course, the real estate bubble that burst created a lot of unemployed people, and sort of by force, a lot of people became entrepreneurs or tried to start businesses, or became available to people who had started businesses or had ideas. And then over the last 4 or 5 years, 6 years, the more and more people got involved in small companies, got involved in startups, and that just created a tremendous amount of activity. A few years ago, there was always this, this Chicago is the second city, and why can't we be more like Silicon Valley? So a few of our technologists kind of got tired of that and said, okay, let's do something here that helps us not just complain, but let's do something about it. So they started a website called Built in Chicago, which was a simple networking website built on a Ning platform. It's kind of one of these social networking platforms, and found out over the first year of their operation that more than 3,000 people signed up. So we said, wow, there's a lot of activity here in this digital startup space, or people who are interested in it. So that, I think, gave them the confidence to build something physical, like 1871. And J.B. Pritzker and the state, and so a couple of others got together and really put the resources behind 1871. Kevin Willard, who had built the Google offices just at the same time, stepped down from Google and took over the Chicagoland Entrepreneurial Center, which took the lead on building 1871. And because they had a lot of support, this was able to be done. And Chicago, like so many things, it doesn't do anything small. So this was a community effort. I credit a lot of the people in the community for getting together and doing that. They traveled around the country, and I think around the world, to look at other similar spaces. And because of the experience with Built in Chicago and the desire to do something big, just decided to build something like 1871. The interesting thing about Chicago, and a big advantage, is that we have a lot of customers in Chicago. We're a huge economy. We are one of the biggest industrial centers, probably, I think, the biggest. If you put a 500-mile radius around Chicago, you'll have quite a substantial portion of America's industry in it. And you have very, very large companies, headquarters here, and there's just a big ecosystem of customers. So the ability for a startup to sell its products is a lot easier here in Chicago than it is places because other places have to travel to find their customers. There's not a lot of customers over there in the Silicon Valley, believe it or not. And that's one of the reasons why most of their startups are web startups, because web startups are global. But, I think to some degree it's almost like Back to the Future. Manufacturing is making a renaissance here in Chicago, not just, let's say, the 3D printing industry, of which we have our idea shop where we have 3D printers, the engineering shop where we had 3D printers, but more advanced manufacturing than that. Manufacturing that allows things to be created that were never effectively been able to be created before. The Digital Manufacturing Institute that Illinois got, and that's a consortium of our universities and companies. That's a really advanced manufacturing capability, and as that grows and becomes more practical, that's going to be really changing the way we make things and the things we can make. I was involved in nanotechnology back in 2002 and the early times when that was the hot thing. Similar to the internet, it kind of on its own went out of favor, but then like the internet, it's actually becoming real and useful. So the ability for people to understand the basic properties of matter and then how to control them at the atomic scale is giving us products that are able to make things a lot better. All of our eyeglasses have coatings that are nano coatings. A lot of things that we're doing with disease control, like gold nanoshells and all of that where you're able to actually control the types of medicines that go very specifically to the diseased parts of the body as opposed to hurting doing collateral damage, hurting healthy cells. All of those things are becoming more and more common as we learn more about them and as we employ them more. And I think that's going to make a big difference. That's where the future's at. Ultimately everything is back to physical, but we had to go through the electronic stage to get back to where now the electronics, the internet, the web, all of that will serve actually the physical industries much better.